We're in a pivotal moment in the battle for gender ideology, and I think that for many of us who've been engaged in this for a while, this is a very depressing, morbid, often ever-escalating topic that we feel like we're constantly being overwhelmed and inundated by what's going on. And I would argue that the tide is actually turning on gender ideology, and we're in a really good spot, especially heading into this election, especially when it comes to the hearts and minds of the American people. But before I get there, I kind of want to lay out the situation for what we're seeing right now and what's going on in the families of average Americans who are having to deal with this battle on their own. I've spent the last few years reporting the stories of detransitioners. I've shared these in my new book. These are young people who tried to do the unthinkable, to change their gender, to become, let's say, go from being a teenage girl to being a teenage boy. That's impossible, and they figure that out pretty quickly, but not after they put themselves through some severe mental and physical torture. And I say torture because this is incredibly hard for them. It's things that they have to deal with, and they already are struggling with mental health issues, when they are struggling with depression, anorexia, when they have parents who are in a terrible family situation. Perhaps they're an alcoholic, perhaps they're divorced. Perhaps they're really lonely. Many of these kids are on the autism spectrum. They're targeted by the transgender community, knowing that children on the autism spectrum are more susceptible to becoming transgender or identifying as transgender. And so these kids go down this path. They're told by doctors and therapists that if they go down this path, they'll be happier. They find out that this is not true, that they were manipulated and lied to, and they're left to pick up the pieces. The current United States medical or clinical stance on the matter is, and this is based off of my interviews with detransitioners, if you tell a doctor as a kid, or if you tell your parents that you're transgender, then you're transgender. There isn't really any argument on the topic. For the parents who do decide to go to mental health professionals and say, I'm worried my beautiful daughter says that she's a boy and I know she's not, they're told, no, she is, because she believes she is. And depending on the state that you're in, if you don't comply with the so-called gender-affirming care standards for your kids, you can lose your children to the state. And I didn't used to believe this was true. Unfortunately, we've seen it happen several times. And one of the most horrific examples, Yali Martinez, a young girl in California, worked with her school counselor, with her friends at school, to come up with a reason why her mother was no longer fit to take care of her. She was taken away from her family by the state of California, put in the state's care, started on testosterone, and not long afterwards took her own life by throwing herself in front of a train. I, as a reporter, was covering this story and obtained the police report from the officers who found Yali's body. They didn't find her body, they found pieces of it all over the train tracks. And it was the most gruesome and horrific thing I've ever read. I included a lot of it in my book, because it shook me to my core, it made me cry, and I think that a lot of other people should have that experience as well and understand the full gravity of what we're talking about when we talk about okaying children's gender transitions. This is not a girl who needed gender-affirming care. This was a girl that needed compassion. She needed her mother, she needed her family, and she was taken away from them and put down this path because of the ideological principles of the left. These far-left activists collaborate with media, lawmakers, corporations, Hollywood, the White House, HHS, all of these entities to push this narrative that gender-affirming care is helping our kids. The White House will tell you in their messaging and in their HHS messaging that gender-affirming care is, quote-unquote, crucial to the health of our trans youth. Gender-affirming care is a euphemism, first of all, for transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, even for kids. The reason that this phrase is used is because it sounds nice. It's gender-affirming care. It's like reproductive health care. It sounds good. It's got the word care in it. It sounds loving. If you use it in polling, people typically think, oh, that sounds good. We should use that. And if you look at polling that polls Americans on do you support gender-affirming care versus polling that asks Americans, do you support transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers for kids, you will find very different answers. And our media is very well aware of this. Our media is absolutely complicit in this battle. They're absolutely pushing a certain narrative. If you look at organizations like the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, which is the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, I always forget their entire acronym, these organizations have media style guides that they give to reporters and say, don't talk about this issue this way, talk about it this way. For example, use gender-affirming care or life-saving care or care for trans youth instead of saying trans surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, because it's less discriminatory, it's less offensive, it's less scary. It helps people to be more on board with the topic. Same thing with abortion, reproductive health care. Don't say heartbeat, say fetal cardiac activity. Don't say late-term abortion. Mention that abortions later in pregnancy are very, very rare or never happen. There's a lot of this going on, and we hear about it, but when we see it in practice, it's even more disturbing than we could have imagined. You look at an Associated Press story on, let's say, Florida banning transgender surgeries and hormones and puberty blockers for kids. The media will tell you that Florida is banning trans care for trans youth. They'll call it an anti-trans bill, and you won't know from their headline or their story what we're actually talking about. I think what people and average Americans are often left with is this vague idea that Florida doesn't want trans kids to have access to antibiotics or something like that, because that's really the messaging they're given. There's no clarity, it's euphemistic and vague on purpose. And so, when we have our media covering this topic in this way, you would imagine that the public would be much more on board with these types of things, but they're not. And that's something that I'm going to come back to in a second. But I think that it's very hopeful in our understanding that Americans are not on board with these evil things. They are very radical, and our fellow Americans don't support them. But while we have our media pushing all of these things on us, we also have the White House and HHS pushing these measures. The White House, like I was saying previously, has issued guidance saying that this type of thing is crucial. HHS, we just found out that they were actively lobbying to get these top transgender organizations to remove age requirements for trans surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers for kids. They were successful in this attempt, and these age restrictions were removed. Why did they want to do that? Because they were concerned that America wasn't open enough to these types of procedures for kids. They were concerned that public sentiment was already hostile to these types of things, and they were right. We also have seen recently some of the only medical whistleblowers who have stepped forward, such as Dr. Etan Heim and a nurse, I believe her name is Olivia in Texas, who spoke out about Texas Children's continuing to do transgender procedures for children. Dr. Etan Heim is now the center of a DOJ investigation. He and his wife, who is 24 months pregnant, I believe, are facing, 24 weeks pregnant, oh my goodness. They're now facing criminal charges by the Department of Justice, and they're fearing for their future family. And the reason for this is that the White House is not interested in finding out if Texas Children's was illegally performing transgender procedures. The White House believes that these procedures are crucial to the health of trans kids. And so in no world is the White House looking for answers and truth in this. They want to continue promoting their transgender ideology at any cost. That should scare us a lot. It's the same thing when it comes to the FACE Act, to the pro-life activists who are being prosecuted by the DOJ for daring to try and stop abortions from taking place. Our Department of Justice has one way of looking at these culture war issues, and that is that anyone who dissents from their ideology is wrong. But particularly when we're talking about gender ideology, and we see European countries changing their laws, changing things to make it so that our kids are protected, we should pause. Because this is something that the United States is becoming very much an outlier in. 5 different European countries have recently said that they're not going to allow kids to have unrestricted access to hormones, to testosterone, and to estrogen. And I could go on for hours about the effects of these hormones on our kids, but let's just say they can cause sexual dysfunction. They can cause infertility. They can ruin your bone density, your bone structure, your muscle structure, fat distribution, mental health issues, so much more. These European countries are actively taking steps to save the kids from these types of things. Meanwhile, in the United States, we have our health officials lobbying to lower the age requirements, so that should tell us a lot. And across the world, largely thanks to the freedom of speech allowed on X, or what we used to call Twitter, we're seeing detransitioners speaking up. And I should hedge and say that this is huge, not only because they're speaking up, but because the young people who are speaking up, such as Chloe Cole, didn't have anyone to speak up when they were going through this. They were online on Reddit, on Facebook, on Instagram, desperately searching for answers as to who they are and why they're here on this earth and what their purpose is. And all they found was the transgender community telling them, obviously you're trans, and love bombing them. Now, a young person who's struggling with her gender identity will see the likes of Chloe Cole, Abel Garcia, Prisha Mosley, Luca Hines saying, I tried this and I can tell you it deeply injured me mentally and physically, and I can live to tell the tale, and I'm speaking up so that you know not to do this. It's so massively huge, and they're so brave for doing this because these are people who have already been treated very badly by the transgender community for daring to say, this wasn't the right choice for me. They're speaking out, putting their face, their story, very intimate, vulnerable story, out for the entire world to understand, and held up for the world's mockery if it chooses. And so I have so much respect for them. I'm so grateful for them for telling their stories. But they're not the only ones who are speaking up and giving me hope. I was texting Riley Gaines yesterday and Paula Scanlon, two of these female athletes who have been brave enough to speak out against men in women's spaces. Riley raced against Leah Thomas in the 2022 NCAAs. I was there, got to see it happen. And Paula shared a locker room with Leah or Will Thomas for a long time, forced to dress and undress in front of a man against her will. And I asked them, they've been traveling the country, they've been speaking to a lot of Americans. Are you hopeful? Are you depressed? How do you feel going forward right now? And they told me they have been receiving such an outpouring of support from everyone, not just conservatives, from many people who tell them that they are liberal or they identify as liberal, from many people who consider themselves part of the LGBTQ community. And they said they're receiving a massive outpouring of support. And Riley specifically said she feels like people are being drawn to the truth more and more and more. These detransitioners are filing lawsuits. They're suing the medical providers who did this to them. That is so huge in so many ways. And just to see these lawsuits, to see Kaiser Permanente named in the lawsuit, to see the surgeon who cut off a teenage girl's breast named in the lawsuit, to be able to reach out to them and say, we can tell you, as a reporter, I can say, I'm reaching out to ask why you performed this double mastectomy on a little girl who had depression, anxiety, and anorexia. Why did you go forward with this? What steps did you take? And we can ask these questions with a lawsuit to back us up. It's a complete game changer. And at the same time, if you Google anti-trans bills, you'll see that these activist groups are in disarray, as I think they like to say about Republicans. There are over 500, quote unquote, anti-trans bills currently out there that are not anti-trans. They're protecting kids from trans surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers. They're protecting women's spaces, women's sports teams. They're banning discussion of gender and sexual orientation in the classroom, or they're saying that kids shouldn't be allowed at offensive drag performances that are not suitable to kids. And that's the work of grassroots activists all over our country. That's the work of lawmakers at the state level and bipartisan groups. And I think that should give us all a great deal of hope. More than that, if you look at polling on this topic shows that a majority of Americans do not support trans surgeries for kids, or procedures, or hormones, or puberty blockers. A majority of Americans don't want men in women's spaces. A majority of Americans don't want their kids to be taught about things that they are not keyed into, especially sexual orientation and gender identity. And the more the left pushes on this issue, the more I have seen people being pushed away from this radical nonsense. I used to like to cover the Women's March a lot. These types of people are the radical left contingent that we're talking about here. They're the ones that actually support these policy measures. Your average American does not. And they didn't really care when it wasn't before their eyes, and now the more they hear about it, the more they're being pushed away, and the less they want to have to deal with this. Americans are waking up. And I think, on the ground reporting on this topic, I have never encountered a person who actually supports transing children that wasn't at the Women's March, and that says a lot to me. So you know what, the farther the left pushes here, the more and more of our Americans are coming to their senses and embracing the truth. And so I would argue in conclusion that we need to be blunter. We need to talk about things that are not very ladylike. For me, a homeschooled Catholic girl, to talk about trans surgeries and genitalia all the time. We gotta do it. We have to be very frank about the realities of what's going on here. These are soccer field conversations. When you're on the soccer field with fellow dad, fellow mom, and you're hearing about a casual story about someone undergoing a gender transition procedure, this is the kind of thing we need to be speaking up on. We need to be having it in small doses, in very frank, casual conversations, and not be afraid of it. I think the truth will set us free in this area, and we need to continue pushing for that and being as blunt as possible. Thank you.